Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Housing Committee this morning. Bearing in mind this is the first meeting of the London Assembly following the incidents in Westminster yesterday, can I ask that we just spend the briefest of moments reminding ourselves that people have lost their lives yesterday, and the very sad loss of PC Keith Palmer doing his job defending the democratic process. So can I just ask that we spend a few moments in silence? Thank you. Thank you very much for that. So we launch on the main business of our meeting this morning. Members of the public can follow this meeting on the webcast and on Twitter. You can use the hashtags Assembly Housing and Between Homes. Can you tell me whether or not any apologies have been received?
There are apologies for lateness from Assembly Member Gavron, Chair.
Thank you. Could we note the list of, and now on to declarations of interest, can we please note the list of offices on the report and ask if anyone has any additional interest to declare? Can I ask if you could confirm the minutes of the meeting of the last meeting of this committee on the 28th of February?
Agreed.
Could you also please note the completed and outstanding list of actions from previous meetings?
Agreed.
In terms of action taken under delegated authority, could you note the recent action taken by myself under delegated authority, namely to agree in consultation with party lead members a joint response to the London Assembly's Planning Committee to the Mayor's Affordable Housing and Viability Supplementary Planning Guidance Consultation? And that is a mouthful.
Agreed.
Thank you. Now let's move on to, sorry about that small moment, the business of the committee that we've just undertaken. Now we're going to get on to the main business of the day. We've looked at our last meeting. We looked at a number of reasons for rough sleeping in London. For this meeting, we move on to the related topic of hidden homelessness. There are indications that hidden forms of homelessness are on the rise, and by some accounts more prevalent than rough sleeping itself. Hidden homelessness is a term which is becoming more widely used, and there are a range of definitions, though it's quite hard to pin down what people mean by hidden homelessness. So for the purposes of this meeting, we are using a working definition of hidden homelessness, hidden homeless people, as those who do not benefit from any formal homelessness support, such as hostels or temporary accommodation, are not in regular contact with their borough or a homelessness support service, are not living with a parent or guardian, do not have the resources or financial means to avoid their current situation, and either have no right to live in a fixed place, whether, for example, through a tenancy or ownership, or cannot stay in a fixed place where they might have a right to stay, due, for example, to fear of abuse and domestic violence. I should flag that we are running a short online survey for people who have experienced hidden homelessness by this definition, and often these people won't have thought of themselves as homeless at all. We really need as many responses to our survey as possible to help us understand this problem better. So if anyone watching the webcast are one of these people, please do take a couple of minutes to complete it. It's all very much anonymous. And then do share the link with other people, and for reference points the URL is london.gov.uk/between homes. So now into our discussion, if we can. We do have with us, well, 2 guests at the moment. We're anticipating a 3rd guest, and I can understand it's quite difficult to get into the building today.
I don't know, Andrew. I think we also have a 3rd guest with us, but the 3rd
No,
guest
we
is...
indeed,
third guest
we
is
do have
rather
a
small.
3rd guest. And we look forward to that.
and probably won't comment too much.
And those guests have personal experience of hidden homelessness. 2 are would classify themselves as hidden homeless, and one is a night stop host, Werner, providing emergency accommodation in their home for young hidden homeless people. For the first part of this meeting, we're going to invite them to tell us a little about their experiences. For example, how they got into the situation and what it feels like to live this way, or what support they offer to hidden homeless people. Afterwards, we'll be putting questions to our panel of guests, who I'll introduce later, and perhaps using the testimony that we're going to hear. So if we can start with the first panel, and thank you for coming in. Perhaps you could introduce yourself and say briefly what you think of as hidden homeless. So, go for it. Teresa.
Okay, so I'm Teresa Davey. I'm a PhD student in London at Imperial College, and I came to the end of my funding period, which was only 3 years, and that obviously is that's not sufficient time to do a PhD in the culture that we have for PhD students. And so after this time, it's very common to find yourself without funding, without any means of support. There's some emergency funding available, but it's absolutely not sufficient to support yourself for the 6 months to a year that you spend finishing your PhD. And so I found myself in the situation where I was unable to keep paying rent, to keep doing these things, and have been sort of sleeping on people's sofas and that sort of thing for the last 6 months or so.
And so, were there other, I mean, presumably you considered at the time options that are available. What options weren't available to you that you might have looked at?
So I think there is some emergency support available from my university, which would cover maybe 2 months, which is good, but not really sufficient. Then beyond that, there's not a great deal of support, because obviously as a PhD student, you can't apply for benefits, you can't get support from that sense because you are a student, and you can't really get a job because you're already employed, be it unpaid, and you have the option to pack it all in, but that's wasting 3 years of study and a lot of resources. So obviously I did those things. I appealed to various sources of funding. Actually, I got some funding that I should get next month, which hopefully will cover me to the end of my studies now. But I've spent the last sort of 6 or 8 months moving around, staying with friends, exhausting friendships, if you like to do that, when I haven't had anywhere to stay, moving between hostels, that sort of thing.
Okay.
But the problem is that the money that you get, it just isn't sufficient, and the time that you're given it for isn't sufficient. And even now, with having a bit of money coming in as a really generous sort of almost gift from academics in my university, I still don't have an income, so I can't sort of get a tenancy, I can't do all of these things. I have no choice but to sort of illegally sublet if I want my own space, or continue sort of sleeping on people's floors and sofas.
Werner, can I ask you, you're a host, could you perhaps explain that position and give us some idea of the people who you've helped?
Yeah, so my name is Verena, and I've been hosting since 2007, first in Leeds and now in London with Night Stop. And over the years I've hosted about 250 young people, I think, together with my partner Dean. I at the moment we host about 5 nights a week, and what surprised me most and really challenged my own assumptions about homelessness was, sorry to be blunt, but how normal the young people are that come through our door. And so it could be, you know, that like you've just described, that they're just difficult circumstances, and they have exhausted their friendships by sofa surfing. They may have their family members may not be in a position to look after themselves, or may not be in the country. So it's literally just, it reminded me how it could happen to every single one of us. And the other thing I've noticed is just how immensely diverse the young people are that are staying with us. So this morning I have a young person, a waved goodbye, who's been a victim of trafficking, and because she hasn't been registered as when she came into this country at the age of 13, she was she fell off the system and didn't really have the rights as a result, like a UK citizen, or young people who've been thrown out by their parents and caregivers because they are gay or transgender, or just everyday family fights, which you sometimes do have when you're 18 or 19, which is completely normal, but you might not be in a position to ask your auntie or your uncle because you only have a single mother and she's fallen out with you.
Could I just very quickly ask, about how long do your guests stay with you? Generally, or is that not possible to say? Is it?
Yeah, it is possible. So the basic agreement is that because it's called Night Stop, they stay with me anyways for 1 night because I'm a short-term host. But in reality, we sometimes agree for them to stay a bit longer because we know that they're waiting for paperwork, for various offices to sort things out. So I have had people stay with me for up to a month in those situations, which is obviously still very short-term.
Thank you, Chair. If I could ask Teresa, I'm quite interested by how people who are in this situation, how you perceive your situation. I mean, did you think of yourself as homeless, hidden homeless? Sort of what sofa surfing is often the term that's used, but can make it sound sort of slightly more sort of glamorous than it actually is. How did you perceive your situation?
Yeah, so I really struggle with defining myself as homeless because for instance, when I've told my friends that I was coming here today, I had quite strong negative reactions, and I don't want to feel like I'm appropriating the term homeless, because obviously I'm still in an incredibly privileged situation that I haven't had to sleep on the street, and although I've, almost run out of friends, I've taken advantage of the generosity of a lot of friends, and I've sort of spent time in hostels in between. I've never been so unfortunate as to sort of not have an alternative. Although I need to be in London to continue doing my PhD, and that means living this kind of lifestyle, I could, if it came to it, borrow money and go home to my parents and pack it in. So defining myself as homeless in that sense is difficult, but I think when it comes to it, the last 8 months when I've been in this situation have been exhausting, and I've really struggled. I've sort of ended up staying with people, and not having your own space for a really extended period of time is exhausting. I haven't had access to sort of kitchen facilities or that sort of thing, which actually really puts a lot of pressure on your lifestyle when you're trying to sort of maintain a job and things. And I've spent, at one point I was commuting 6 hours a day just to do this, which is so exhausting, and it's really worn me out, and it's extended my PhD months beyond the time it should have taken to finish. It's had me pushed right to the edge of that. So
sorry.
No.
I was going to say, did you ever approach your sort of local council for help?
No, I mean, I didn't really realise that would have been an option. I think if it had come to it where I really ran out of even acquaintances, then I would have done that. I think I'm very fortunate being in the student community. There's a lot of people in the situation. I've had people stay in my house for months before when they haven't had anywhere else to live, when I've had houses in the past.
So you've also hosted people who themselves have been homeless in the past?
Yeah, and I think amongst the student community it's really common. Even acquaintances I've had People I don't know very well have said, absolutely come and stay with me. And I've been really lucky in that sense that people understand and there is a community.
Thank you.
Assemblymember Cooper.
Thank you, Chair. I mean, I'm really interested in what you're saying about it's really common in the student community, and I just wondered if you think that's more the case in London, where there's an awful lot of different London colleges, whereas outside of London, even though you may not be given somewhere on campus or in halls or in student accommodation of some description or another for all 3 or 4 years of your course, outside of London, I think there might be slightly better provision for people who are studying. Do you think that is the case? And obviously, things are just more expensive here, aren't they?
Yeah, so I've only ever studied in London. I've done all of my degrees at Imperial College here. And so I can't really comment on what it's like being in other universities. But although like the minimum stipends that students can receive, although they're greater in London, the disparity in income you get is not sufficient to cover the additional expenses of living in London. Particularly so my university is based in South Kensington. It's the most expensive part of London. Obviously no one expects to live there, but you expect to live within a reasonable commutable distance, which means that it's a lot more expensive to go to university there than it is to go to a university in East London or something. And that's not accounted for in the amount of money you receive. Like they take it as though you can live really far out and get sort of £2,000 a year more than someone, you know, living in South Wales or something. It doesn't cover the difference. And I think that's a problem as well, like because of space here we're forced into the private housing sector, whereas a lot of other cities and towns have a lot more student housing, which just isn't available in London. So we're pushed into the private housing sector, rents skyrocket because they just take advantage of students. Come September when everyone's moving in, the prices jump up sort of 10-20% because they know students pay.
So if I could just do a follow-up to that, if that's okay. I mean, certainly in seaside towns, University of Lancaster, University of Brighton, places like that, there seems to be some more availability, although students are very seriously encouraged to leave over the summer period so that they can bring in guests into guest houses who are there on holiday. Obviously, there isn't that availability in London, but there are some larger houses. Are you aware of, I mean, certainly I know people who are now sharing privately rented houses in conditions that I would probably consider to be overcrowded. And it might be their own place, it's sort of in the sense that they're all living there and they might not be moving around all the time continuously, and they might have a sort of a corner where they can, you know, make it their own. But there really is quite a lot of people there sharing. Is that something you're aware of as well?
Yeah, so I mean, I have friends who live in rooms which they're basically hostel rooms, but they're privately rented hostels, basically. But as well, in my time staying in hostels, I've done sort of weeks here and there in hostels. Hostels in London, I found, are not like hostels I've stayed anywhere else. They're full of long-term people in situations like me, people who can't rent somewhere, who can't sign a lease, who can't do anything. And I was really surprised to find that. And there's sort of a sense of community, and that people are really friendly because they've all been there. They're living together in these sort of 12-bed rooms or 20-bed rooms, quite long-term. And it's still expensive, but it definitely is something that people are doing, and I don't think it's fair, from a student perspective particularly, I don't think it's fair to have people live in conditions like that and expect them to really get the best out of their education.
Yeah, it's really hard to study when you're in that kind of situation. Thank you, Chair.
If I could ask Werner, the people who stay with you, where do they typically go on to after they've had their stay with you? Or again, is that easy to quantify? Sure.
That's probably quite a hard question for me to ask because the Night Stop team deals with that. But the experience I have is that very often they come back. So the other day I had somebody who came back to stay with me, who was a person who couldn't hear, and that person came back to stay with me after I had seen him 6 months ago previously, and he stayed with Night Stop during that time because his situation was so complex.
Right.
So it was literally one night, most nights, different place. But maybe you can answer that better than I can.
Assemblymember Berry, you wanted to come in there, sorry.
Yeah, I think potentially Verna or possibly Nicola might be able to answer this. Obviously we've got quite a lot about the student perspective, but I wanted to know if there were many people who stayed with you who were employed but on low incomes. Is that something you've noticed? People who have jobs but
If we can,
not
if we can move on to our other guests after we've done that section. Would
Fine,
that be
yeah,
all right?
just if
Would
Verna
that be
can't
all right?
answer, then maybe it might be
Yeah.
appropriate. I don't know.
So you cited one example of somebody who comes back, and you've said that you've had about 250, I mean, good on you, guests over that period. Have you built a relationship with any of them that have lasted? Yeah.
Well, technically, we're encouraged to not build a relationship beyond that initial promise of one night, because it would be unfair if the young person would expect a long-term relationship with an individual like me. However, so apologies, my Night Stop colleagues, if I've broken the rule. However, obviously, if people come and stay with me longer, there's no doubt, like I have built some really meaningful relations with people and had meaningful conversations. So, giving advice on CVs, giving advice on how to dress for the job interview when you know the person is going for their third job interview after they've been staying with you for 3 weeks. And listening, because these people have gone through sometimes traumatic experiences, sometimes have been abused, sometimes are staying in a violent family, as one of you have described, in one room, 8 people in one room, with violent family dynamics. And with that particular person I'm thinking of, I just listened to her for 2 hours sharing her story. I'm not a counsellor, I don't want to be, and I encouraged her to buy a Night Stop to access counselling support. But I think that she really valued just speaking to a normal person who wasn't paid to be there for her.
You obviously find this work quite rewarding. Why is that?
Well, so, there's an altruistic element, of course, but from a selfish perspective, I get so much from it because most of the young people that stay with me are very inspiring. They talk surprisingly a lot about the future and where they want to go. They talk about their vision for the future, and they tell me, about, for example, one young person told me about an inspirational talk he's listened to from his pastor, which actually was quite relevant for my situation at the time as well. And that inspiration is immense. And then the other thing is just the diversity. I quite enjoy meeting different people, and I don't think I would have had the chance to have an over dinner conversation written down because the person wasn't able to hear or speak as a deaf individual. I don't think I would have been able to speak to a young transgender man. I spoke to people from all over the world. I've met a trafficking victim. I've met people who are studying at university, who are going for their first job interviews, and it's very rewarding to be part of a very small part of that journey.
Can I just ask Teresa again? I mean, can you see a way out of the situation you're in?
So I was really fortunate. I wrote an article for my student newspaper, and through that various, sort of about my situation and about how I thought the system was broken. And through that, actually, several people reached out to me and offered me sources of funding, which kind of are helping, and hopefully I'll finish my PhD next month. So that is a way out. I mean, so the really tricky thing for me is that I actually have a job lined up when I finish my PhD. It's just getting to the point of finishing it is the problem. So it's easier for me in a sense that I have an end goal. Like, I know when it will end. It's just getting through to that. But even now, like as I said before, even now I have some money that means I can get through this last couple of months a bit more easily. I still can't really find somewhere to live without sort of illegally subletting a room off Gumtree or something, I can't take out a contract. I can't, God forbid, if I need to kind of buy a new phone, get a new phone contract, or, do anything that requires a credit rating. I still don't officially have an income or really enough money to survive. I mean, I say I have a bit more money. I'm illegally subletting a tiny room, which is space for a bed where the mattress is mouldy and there's damp on the walls. Like, but it's my space, and it means not having a 5 hours a day commute. So, like, that's great for me.
How have you identified places where to stay? I imagine, I think you alluded to it earlier, you said that you've kind of risked some friendships over...
Yeah, so I'm really fortunate in that I'm sort of late enough in my sort of student career that a lot of my friends are sort of real grown-ups, if you like, with jobs and houses, that they have space that they can put someone up for like a month at a time or something. And I've been really fortunate to have really amazing friends in that sense. I also, but like obviously if they need their space for whatever reason, I have to leave. Like, it's not my space. I have to always be ready to move all my things at short notice. Also, but I've spoken about my situation. I've tried to sort of be as open as I can with my friends about the situation and people I meet, and huge numbers of people have offered places to stay. A lot of people have a sofa or half of a bed, if you know them well enough, or a floor that you can sleep on if it really comes to it. And when I've really struggled, like I said, hostels have been there. And even colleagues, sort of supervisors I work with, I've stayed with them and they've offered spaces for me as well. So.
Can I now ask Werner, in sort of coming to a conclusion in this part of our meeting, what do you think your guests have got from the experience of coming to you? How have you helped them? You've obviously provided a roof over their head, but how else have you helped them?
Well, obviously, you know, that would be for them to answer. But what they've shared with me is that they feel valued as human beings, because I welcome them as a guest and not as a host of a hostel or homelessness service. And they feel that they are human beings with a value. I also think that some of them have experienced it positively, just to observe me and my family in our usually normal family life, especially for people that have come from challenging backgrounds. And also, they've really valued when, for example, they were going for job interviews, or they were going, you know, they're working and trying very hard to keep it all together, that I was sharing how much I admired them, and my partner and I, you know, sometimes shared our own stories as well, because we haven't always been as wealthy and in as good situation as we are now. So that's what I would say they probably would get from staying with us.
Thank you. Are there any other questions in this part of the meeting? Thank you very much, both Vern and Teresa, for giving your testimony to this today. You're welcome to stay and contribute, but you're free to go if you want to do it. I kind of understand. But you're welcome to stay as well, of course. If we can now move on to the...
We should especially thank our little guest, who's been very
good.
He's been very good.
Yeah.
He might be our youngest witness ever.
So if we can now move on to the second half of our meeting, which I'm gradually will get to eventually. Okay, that's it. Thank you so much. We all need a little help occasionally. We now have, we're going to question a panel of practitioners and academics to discuss some of these issues with them. As I said, if either of our guests want to, if a previous guest wants to chip in, they can. The second panel is made up of Nicola Harwood, who is the head of Night Stop DePaul UK. We also have Bob Green, who's Chief Executive Officer of Stonewall Housing, Dr. Kezia Reeve, who's the Principal Research Fellow for the Centre for Regional Economic and Social Research at Sheffield Hallam University, and Mary Mason, who's Chief Executive Officer of Solace Women's Aid. Welcome to you all. If I can start off with the question to Dr. Reeve, do we have any idea about how big this issue is in London at the moment?
Okay, well, in 2010-11, myself and colleagues did some research looking precisely at this issue of hidden homelessness. That was a little while ago now, but I understand I think it is still the most recent evidence that we have about the scale of hidden homelessness. It was a nationwide study, but around half of the survey respondents for that study were in London. We weren't able to do a kind of geographical analysis because in some other parts of the country where we surveyed, the numbers were too small once you got down to that scale. But certainly, I've had a bit of a look at that, and the results for London were, similar to other parts of the country. And what that research found was that we did a survey that was a kind of snapshot. We did it over a week rather than a night, so it wasn't quite a perfect snapshot, but it was about as good as we could get. And 62% of the homeless people that we surveyed were hidden homeless. 62% were hidden homeless on the night before they were surveyed. And 92% had experienced hidden homelessness. So I think in London it was slightly higher than that. It was around 70%, I think. Now, our definition of hidden homelessness was slightly different from yours, and I know you said at the beginning, there is no common definition, which I think is understandable, and I think it's fine, because people sometimes are thinking about different types of populations, and it's a perfectly acceptable term to use, but we don't have a standard definition. And so our definition was people who meet the statutory definition of homelessness, so they are homeless, but they're living outside mainstream housing provision. So any accommodation that's provided by an organisation, hostels, night shelters, things like that, they wouldn't be classed as hidden homeless. But what that meant was that rough sleepers were included within our definition of hidden homelessness. I'm not quite sure in the definition that you're using whether some rough sleepers would fall within your definition or whether they're excluded. I'm not quite sure. We partly included them because we needed a simple definition, and we felt that the definition that we came up with, we were interested in people essentially who were kind of outside the system, if you like. So we felt that definition worked, even though it seemed a bit counterintuitive because rough sleeping is the most visible form of homelessness, so it seems a bit strange to then call them hidden homeless. But actually, I think it was quite important that we included them because we knew, for example, nearly half of the rough sleepers in our sample had never had contact with a rough sleepers team. We also know from other research...
This is the London?
This was across the sample, but as I said, the results were not particularly different across the different locations. And previous work that I've done, particularly about homeless women, focused on homeless women, we found that the majority, 60% of the homeless women that we'd surveyed in that different research had slept rough, and only 12% had contact with the rough sleepers team. Now, this was some time ago. The situation may well have changed, but rough sleepers teams were in place then. The support was there, and so actually, I think there probably are quite a lot of rough sleepers who you would describe as hidden. Anyway, my point about saying that, though, is that our definition might include more, it includes that group of people as well, so 62% is very high. On the other hand, it probably didn't capture some of the people that you're interested in, and we heard earlier from the woman there, the students, people who are working, who probably don't access homelessness services, and we recruited all of our respondents through day centres. And so people that maybe are less likely to use those kind of services would not have showed up in our sample. And I think in London, you've probably got a very sizable group of hidden homeless people in that kind of situation, I would say more so than other parts of the country. So there's probably a group missing from our statistics, if you like, as well. So I think it is a significant problem.
And would anybody else like to comment on that, on the the size of the problem, whether or not it's getting worse or better?
I could add to that in terms of, we're particularly interested in women who have experienced violence, not just domestic abuse, but also sexual abuse, or other forms of violence against women and girls, who are not able to safely remain in the property that they have been living in and become homeless. So one of the issues at the moment is the number of refuge bed spaces is decreasing. We've lost refuge spaces in London. So currently there's approximately 820 bed spaces. And the most recent survey that's been carried out in London shows that 58% of applicants to refuges are unsuccessful. And of the 42% that are successful in gaining a refuge space, that success goes down steeply for those women who are more vulnerable. So only 17% of women with problematic substance use gain a space in a refuge.
Which refuges are we talking about?
All refuges in London.
All refuges.
So we're talking about London refuges, where there are 820 bed spaces in London.
Sorry, how many?
820 bed spaces in London.
Can we just check how that's gone down? Because there wasn't much emphasis on refuge, much more on rape crisis centres in the last administration. I just wondered, has it fallen?
Yes, the number of refuge spaces in London has fallen.
By
I haven't got the exact statistics,
when?
and I could send them to you.
Would these typically be provided by boroughs?
They are funded by boroughs. London Council funds a few refuge spaces for those who are particularly vulnerable and who need additional support. But that's 14 bed spaces in London.
Oh, right.
So I can give you the full figures of where they've gone, figures over the last 5 years. I can send them in.
Yeah. Wonderful, thank you.
Yeah, so the particular issue about refuge spaces is that they have decreased, as pointed out, over the last probably 8 years, that kind of period of time. They've been slowly decreasing, with some steep decreases where funding to local authorities has been reduced. So the point I'm making is that what we've got is the situation where, of those women who desperately need to come into a refuge in an emergency, 58% of those women are unable to do so, and so therefore need to find a different solution to their problem. And for a lot of those women, they will become hidden homeless, so they may stay with friends or relatives for the short term, but that is not that is very unsafe, because the perpetrator will find them. The perpetrators of abuse, victim of abuse is much more unsafe at the point at which they leave the relationship, because the perpetrator is more likely to be looking for them, and something like 90% of domestic homicides take place when somebody is trying to leave that relationship. So it's a particularly vulnerable time for a woman and women and children. So those women, if they're unsuccessful, they have different measures they can take. But the measures that they can take, like going to the local authority homelessness, we know that if they're not a priority need, or if they're vulnerable and might come under a priority need, that very often they're turned away. We have women and children who should be a priority need who are turned away. We had a woman last week who was turned away because the housing officer said that he had contacted the alleged perpetrator, and he had told her that she was fine and there was a home waiting for her and she should return home. So the local authority was not willing to support her and her children. So obviously we're able to help those people who come to our attention and intervene with housing support and advocacy and help. But where somebody doesn't come to our attention, and we don't know how wide that number is, we're not able to provide that support. So I think the other issue that we have around hidden homeless is that of the women who come into our temporary accommodation and refuges, so in 2015, 1,383 women moved on from refuge accommodation in London, and 47% of those moved into insecure accommodation. Some of those returned to the perpetrator, but that was only 5%. But for others, they were moving out of the refuge but did not have anywhere secure to move to. So their choices were moving in with family and friends, sofa surfing, and we know that the tolerance of that reduces over a period of time because obviously people can't put up with that for a long period. So this might include people who were not found to be in priority need for a variety of reasons. Maybe they were found to be intentionally homeless, and also includes those who wouldn't be in any case in priority need because the level of vulnerability that's needed is very high in order to get access to local authority support. So a wide number of hidden homeless. We also looked at, held a study of 100 women leaving services over a 3-year period and followed their housing needs. 87% had to leave their home because of abuse. These weren't just women coming into refuges, but women who were using services. 44% of those moved once.
When you say using services...
Using domestic abuse services, or sexual abuse services. They might be using an advocacy service, an advice service, some kind of support, or they might have been in refuge. But for those women, 87% had to leave their home to end the abuse. So it's very common for women who experience abuse, whether or not they've got children, to have to leave their home as the only means of escaping that abuse.
And has this, for this section, have you seen a trend? And obviously you've cited the reduction in refuges, which assume we then assume that must mean an increase in hidden homeless. In terms of the domestic abuse that is, if you want, generating the situation, has there been an increase or decrease as far as you're concerned, or anything perceptible?
There's been a huge increase in reported domestic abuse in London and reported sexual abuse in London. So it's gone up over 25%, the reporting of domestic abuse in London. We don't know what the figures are.
Why more people are reporting?
Sorry, because those are the statistics that we've got. We know that somewhere between about 25% of people do not report to 30% do not report. These are just pieces of research, and we can provide you with references if you wish. But there has been a huge increase in London, and there's also been a huge increase of sexual abuse. And I think that although domestic abuse is cited here, I think it's really important that we understand what's happening to victims of sexual abuse. So by far the most, the numbers of women who experience sexual abuse, and it's by far women rather than men who experience sexual abuse, well obviously some young men do in particular. But there is, for those women who experience sexual abuse, they are more likely, very far more likely than not, to know the perpetrator and therefore not to feel continually safe in their home, whether the perpetrator is a family member and they are children or young people, or whether the perpetrator is a neighbour or a friend or somebody, they nevertheless know where they are, and that often creates homelessness.
Yeah, I mean, I think 15% of people who sleep rough are women, which suggests that women are more likely to stay in situations if there is sexual or domestic abuse than men are to stop themselves going onto the streets. Is that the case? Are women more likely to stay with an abusive partner to keep a roof over their head rather than going onto the streets?
Of homeless women, then there are far higher rates of women who've experienced partner violence than men. So it's a much broader problem, obviously. And yes, a lot of women will stay in the family home and particularly because of their children, then leave. So a lot of women are staying in a vulnerable situation rather than becoming homeless. And a lot of women will be taken in for short periods of time by family and friends until a crisis arises and they've got nobody left to go to. So I think there's a range of different options that women are more likely to go through. But also, of course, there's the local authority option if they're a priority need, which is less available if you don't have children.
Dr. Reeve, is there...
I just wanted to make a brief point on the proportion of women rough sleeping, and I just think we need to exercise some caution about that, although I agree absolutely with your point and your question that women might be more likely to stay in those situations, but because we know that women make concerted efforts to remain invisible while they sleep rough, and I do have some research evidence on that, employing a range of strategies of invisibility and keeping out of the way and so on. I think rough sleeping amongst women is actually much higher than we think.
So they wouldn't show up in the counts, for example?
Whatever,
right.
yeah, absolutely.
I just wanted to just check. We know there's been a concerted effort over the last sort of 16 years, certainly while there's been a GLA, to actually in a Metropolitan Police Authority, to make sure that this iceberg crime of domestic violence is reported more. And so the reporting would go up. But you have evidence that there's much more domestic.
No, it was the reporting that I was talking about. There's been a huge
because
increase in
I
reporting.
just wanted to make a distinction between that.
Because it's not possible to know if that's a good thing or a bad thing.
No.
No, it's pure conjecture. Perhaps if we can move on to Assemblymember Berry, your question, please.
Well, we've covered quite a lot of it. Can we bring in Bob at this point, maybe,
Yes,
to ask about the sort of experience of LGBT plus people? We believe there may be more chance of things like family breakdown, some of the factors we've talked about, maybe leading to homelessness there. But what's your work on that? What's that?
I mean, I'd like to make a comment basically about the size of the hidden homeless population. Basically, with no idea, absolutely no idea. We did a piece of research last year called Finding Safe Spaces. It was a small research project, and it backs up with what Dr. Reeve was mentioning there. We compared the experiences within Manchester, Brighton and London, so-called LGBT beacon cities where people consider that it's safer to live here because there's more LGBT people living here, supposedly. And what the experiences were there, that anybody experiencing homelessness were hidden, and they weren't being picked up by rough sleeping teams, and they weren't even being picked up by a lot of LGBT charities themselves, because on the one hand there was stigma of their sexual orientation and gender identity, but on the other hand there was stigma about being homeless. So they were hidden from everyone. And the idea then that we can come out with certain figures and base strategy on what the experiences of different organisations are is very difficult, because organisations are not asking the questions, are you lesbian, gay, bisexual or transgender? For example, there's the guidance from certain homelessness agencies about, and that doesn't include how to ask the question around sexual orientation. And it can ask the question about transgender as a third gender, and that makes a lot of trans people very uncomfortable. So the idea is we need to get a better picture and better data gathering, better evidence of the experiences of lesbian, gay, bisexual and trans people, better evidence and data from homelessness agencies, better from the local authorities. Local authorities aren't asking the question when somebody comes and identifies. So when they make an assessment about whether they're, priority need or not, or eligible for support, we've no idea how many are lesbian, gay, bisexual or transgender. So for our communities, we're all hidden. But who's hidden it? What they're hidden from perhaps homelessness agencies or perhaps hidden from local authorities, but they're not hidden from us. We can direct you to them. When we did our research, there were certain rough sleepers, for example, who were not sleeping in the areas that rough sleeping teams went to because they didn't feel safe there. But we can direct you to them. And I mentioned this to some outreach teams and said that they're in this park at this time, but the outreach team said, no, we don't go to that park. So I think we need to be very clear when we're talking about the size of the issue, and I know this is clear, we've no idea. I'm talking about Dr. Reeves. I agree with Dr. Reeves about saying that the definition is very difficult to come up with a definition. So when we talk about this today, I think we need to keep that in mind, that it's a very big issue with no idea, no clarity, but as Mary said, what figures we do have show that it's a very big issue, and what figures we have, which we'll talk about through today, is showing that there's an epidemic out there and we need to do something about it. And hopefully with this meeting we can start directing a strategic approach rather than just sticking plaster approaches is what maybe previous mayors have done.
I mean, that sort of answers some of the issues of how difficult it is once people become homeless. The thing we're trying to get to today, I think, is because we know that rough sleeping is going up, we can assume there might be also this iceberg of people who are just about hanging in there, who are hidden, who are not being picked up by the rough sleeping statistics. But also we're trying to get to what are the reasons for people getting into that situation. Is that different for LGBT people? Is there more likely to be family breakdown, for example? Do you have an idea of the sort of prevalence of the problem as well as...
More likely what, sorry?
The prevalence, is it more likely that there's family breakdown and those kinds of factors that we've talked about in relation to women and domestic violence?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the big reasons. I mean, we provide housing advice and housing support to all ages. And the big issues that people come to us around family breakdown, harassment and domestic abuse. Those are the big three issues. And by family breakdown, I also include relationship breakdown. And for the proportion at the moment, we said there's about 15% of people are what we call sofa surfing, so they're relying on friends for their accommodation. 10% are rough sleeping on the streets, so they've no more friends to rely on, or they don't have that friend network that they can rely on. They don't have a family network. When we look at young people, those figures go much higher. So when we look at young people, we're talking about 20% of our clients are living or rough sleeping, and about 40% are sofa surfing. So for the experiences of younger people, it's much more stark. And that's because they don't have their family support mechanisms. And Verna was mentioning that, using Night Stop, which has been good for some of our communities, that emergency space. And what we're seeing is there are more trans people coming through, asking for advice and asking for support, because they specifically don't have that family support network, which other people may be able to rely on. So they could go to live with, aunts, uncles, cousins, or whatever. But with identifying as a trans person, they completely lose that family support. And so the ones that actually do need more support from organisations are actually too frightened to go to the organisation, or the organisations don't understand their needs. And so they need to then rough sleep or rely on friends. But the issue there is, where do you have your privacy? As Theresa was saying, you don't have your own space. Where do you keep your medication if you're hormone replacements? Where do you keep if you're HIV positive, where do you keep your medication? The things like that, all these issues come up with specifically for our organisations.
Can I ask both you and Mary about the homelessness duty? Because it seems to me like you're talking about people who are by definition vulnerable, and yet they're not getting help from local authorities. What's the problem there? Is it just that the local authorities are pulling up the criteria, or what?
As Mary said, the bar's so high now, it's very difficult to get accepted on a local authority list. And for a lot of local authorities to discharge duty now is quite simply to direct people to private rented sector, or even to offer them a list and say, here, there's a list of agencies you can go and contact. So, I mean, we've had people turn up at our door that don't identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual or transgender. It's just that they're on a list of agencies that a local authority have given them, and they're desperate for support, desperate for help. And so we try and approach other agencies to give them support.
Even for those who've got priority need, then there is an issue about, we've had women with children who are priority need being given a list when they've presented at homelessness. So not actually being given support, but just been said, here's a list of places that you can go to. So it's even worse for those who are, as you say, the barriers are really high now. So if somebody presents who's experienced sexual or domestic abuse, they would be asked for evidence of that. And unless you can provide a police report, and we know that 70% of reports to the police, even where you have reported to the police, 70% of sexual violence cases are dropped by the police. So because of evidence.
70%.
70% of women who report to the police that they've experienced sexual abuse, their case will go no further. It'll be DNA'd because of lack of evidence, or because they won't make a good witness. So to get the evidence that you would need in order to prove in housing that you can't remain in your accommodation or that you're homeless because of sexual abuse is really, really problematic. Even if you do, if you are not in priority need, then you almost certainly won't be able to get the support that any support with your housing. So that's got a huge knock-on effect into the number of women. What we've seen is an increase in reports and a huge decrease in those who are being accepted. If you're vulnerable, i.e. mental health or drugs and alcohol or any other vulnerability, then other than the violence and abuse you've experienced, then getting housing is almost impossible now. So you are more likely just to be given, as Bob said, a list and told to go to either a hostel. There's a real issue for women in going to hostels because there are so few hospital spaces that are women only, and a lot of women go into hostels and are abused, raped in the hostel. So will not go back into the hostel because of their vulnerability around sexual abuse and rape. And we've got research that we can follow up. I was saying to Tom earlier that I can send you research that backs up what I'm saying.
That chimes with our research on when we looked at homeless women, real reluctance around hostels, night shelters particularly. Yeah.
And likewise for young people as well, that are often very reluctant to go to hostels because there's people much older than them with much more complex needs than perhaps they're facing.
I've seen some grim ones in my time. There are very good ones.
Can we finally ask the panellists about young people as a group and what extra pressures there might be? I don't know if Kezia or Nicola might have some insight into that.
So I mean, similar things to what Bob and Mary have mentioned already. I mean, family breakdown and relationship breakdown is by far the main reason that young people come to access help from Night Stop. But equally, fleeing violence is one of the most common reasons. I think most of the young people that come to Night Stop are that particular type of person experiencing hidden homelessness who have perhaps been excluded from other services and have been passed around lots of different places without being able to find somewhere. And what Night Stop manages to do is give them that kind of nurturing space and protect them without putting them alongside more complex and vulnerable adults. The kind of issues that they are facing can be a huge range, really. And you asked the question earlier about how many of them are working, and it always astounds me, particularly in London, how many young people accessing Night Stop are maintaining jobs, in cafes and restaurants, and trying to juggle that against finding long-term secure accommodation.
Assembly Member Gavin, yeah.
Yes, I don't know if this is relevant to this section, but it's something I sort of really would like to know the answer to, which is when we're talking about local authorities and how you have to, it's a very high benchmark to actually get any help. Just wondered, there's a supporting people's allowance or scheme which all boroughs get, and I know it's been cut, but the borough itself, the council, can decide who is in priority.
We have got a question about that.
Oh, we have? Okay, well, I will. Because I was just interested to know.
Assembly Member Berry, have you finished your question? Yep. Assembly Member Curtin.
Thank you, Chairman. I'll stick with you, Bob, to begin with. My section really concerns the types of accommodation which are available to people who are hidden homeless, and we've heard from you. Sofa surfing is one of the biggest ones, particularly with young people. You also say some slip into rough sleeping, but then we've also got refuges and shelters and Night Stop and other things. Do you think, are they the only types of accommodation available, or are there other kinds of accommodation which hidden homeless people can find, apart from the things that we've already heard or are they the main ones?
I mean, the problem is for our communities is there's very few housing options. So if a young lesbian, gay, bisexual or trans person was to come to us today, we have 41 bed spaces across the whole of London for supported accommodation. Last year we opened another 12 bed spaces for people over the age of 25, because we recognise with the shared accommodation rate that there's very limited options for people between 25 and 35. And so we're offering that safe space where people can support each other within a housing scheme. So that's 41 plus 12, 53. There's another project in West London, which is another 6. So we're roughly about 60 bed spaces, specifically for LGBT people. And there are age restrictions attached to those. And we'll talk later, as Nicky Gavron was mentioning, about there are now restrictions about who can access those and who can't access those. So there's a very limited amount of accommodation. So it's now more private rented sector. That's basically where people are being directed towards. And we'll talk about the reforms and the impact of that, and that's going to be much more difficult for young people especially to access. But other than that, it is rough sleeping. We're having to advise more people about how to sleep rough safely and how to look after your health and so on. We have guides, and we have last year we made a video with a company to explain to young people how to sleep rough safely, where to find the best part in a park or a playground where you can be the warmest. This is ridiculous. It's in London in 2017. But besides that, we're trying to think about more emergency accommodation. So we're working with Night Stop, and we're part of what's called the London Youth Gateway. And thankfully, we're funded for another 4 years with London councils. And this is the only youth homelessness focused project. And that's great, because now we're looking at, how can we prevent homelessness as well as provide emergency and supported accommodation. But it really is trying to prevent homelessness, and how do we get people to think about alternatives, and how do we think about, well, family mediation may not work for a lot of our clients, and relationship mediation, so we need to think about alternatives. And the problem is, with the future of supported housing, which we'll talk about later, I'm sure, that's the future of our housing's in question. So the limited options are already there will become more limited.
Does hidden homelessness slip into rough sleeping very often? How often does that happen, do you think? People who were not found anywhere secure, but perhaps sofa surfing or have a place in a hostel. How often does that go back into someone sleeping rough? I mean, maybe I can open it up to everybody.
Yeah, I'm just looking, actually, sorry, you speak if you've got something to say, because I think I might have part of an answer in here, so if you want to...
I suppose, for me, it's kind of a question about what are we defining as rough sleeping and as hidden homeless anyway, because, we have so many young people that come to us who have been sleeping in train stations, or they might not necessarily have been sleeping, but just staying there to stay safe, or riding night buses, and actually, aren't we saying that is rough sleeping as well anyway? So there is such an overlap between the two, because both are incredibly unsafe. And I think it's about thinking beyond the usual traditional sleeping in a park on a bench somewhere, and actually, particularly for young people, and as you mentioned about young women as well, it's how you kind of stay invisible from all the kind of unsafe things out there.
We hear sometimes about people sleeping in airports, for example.
Yeah.
Well, in fact, just last week we had someone come to us who had been staying in Heathrow Airport for 2-3 weeks, and there's just as many risks with that.
For women who experienced abuse, then it's not just an issue of being young. So at the moment, for example, we're working with somebody who is 54 years old, who has been homeless for the last 3 years after leaving a violent relationship, and she had been diagnosed as autistic when she was younger in Jamaica, and is a British citizen now, but has been unable to get any support from local authorities because they won't accept her definition. She can't get housing, so she's sleeping. At the moment, she's staying with a pastor, but she has been staying in different places, and including with perpetrators of violence, and she's been raped, she's been sexually exploited, she's been used by a pimp because she didn't have anywhere else to live. So she's been through an enormous amount in the last 3 years, and we still are unable to get her into housing. She's not quite old enough to get into older people's accommodation. If she survives long enough, then when she's 55, we'll be able to help her to get into older people's accommodation, but she's only 53. So I think that's, the fact is that a lot of people go through, for us, we have 16 to 60 plus who are homeless and who have been hidden homeless. And very often those with multiple needs, for example, this woman who's autistic, are the most vulnerable. Of the other places that people stay, we have quite a lot of women who stay with faith groups, and we have links with faith groups across London who are willing to help, particularly for somebody who's of that faith. A lot of women stay in cars, even women and children are staying in a car, in buses, as people have mentioned. So trying to find some way of not being on the street for women is particularly important because of the increased vulnerability to rape and sexual exploitation. But also we have a lot of women who have remained in a situation of sexual exploitation because they don't have anywhere else to live. So continuing to live with a pimp, or to move from one man who's abusing them to another man who's abusing them in order to keep in accommodation. And very often, if you look at the statistics around domestic violence homicides, and there is some information in London about that, a lot of domestic violence homicides will relate to somebody not having a home to live in of their own, and therefore living vulnerably or living with somebody who is either abusing them or pimping them.
I think just to add to that as well, I mean, we know a lot of young women have actually entered unhealthy relationships as well to try and find somewhere safe to stay, so particularly where they have befriended somebody and they know it's unsafe, but at the end of the day it's somewhere safe for them to sleep that evening.
And I think the important point to make there is that women do that explicitly in order to get accommodation.
Exactly.
This is not part of some other kind of lifestyle, and they articulate it in that way, and that's certainly come through our research as well. Women who return to often violent relationships for short periods of time as a way of avoiding rough sleeping, often women forming brief sexual relationships a night or two, going home with strangers, that kind of thing. And also we've come across people who have, men and women, but more commonly women, who've engaged in sex work in order to earn money to pay for a B&B. So again, explicitly around finding accommodation. We've also found, and we don't know the scale of this, I think this is the problem, but people coming in, sort of finding arrangements with acquaintances around exchanging domestic tasks in order to be allowed to stay there for a while, and it's, those kind of arrangements are never very clear. Our respondents are often then exploited a little in those situations, caring for people in exchange for being able to sleep on the sofa, and those kind of solutions. I don't like to call them solutions. So I think there's a whole range of ways that people are, usually in order to avoid rough sleeping, are kind of trying to get themselves accommodated, that we don't know a lot about. We know it's happening, we just don't know what the scale of it is. And that is why rough sleeping, I was just looking at this report, I can't find the bit that I was looking for, but a lot of our work actually traces people's housing careers. So we look exactly at where they go from here to here to here, and rough sleeping often just turns up in between everything else. So people will stay with friends, and then they'll have to rough sleep for a couple of nights before they then manage to maybe get a night in a shelter or something like that. So rough sleeping just comes throughout people's housing careers.
That rough sleeping might be someone staying on a bus, so they would be hidden
absolutely.
Homeless still, because you wouldn't notice. You just think there's someone travelling, but they are.
That's right. And in the airports, so we've interviewed people that have stayed in airports, and they talk about making sure they don't look homeless. So they take luggage with them. things like that. You know, they take something with them that looks like luggage, so they look like another passenger. So, you know, so again, it's about not looking like you're sleeping rough, but essentially that is what you're doing.
Could just on the point about sexual abuse, I mean, I remember a couple of years ago there were these adverts appearing, men advertising essentially for women to sleep in bed with them. And I remember distinctly there was some press coverage of this. Is this something that you're aware of? Mary,
we do have women coming into our services who have answered an advert and gone and lived with somebody who's then raped them. And then they then have to find somewhere else to live, or have to stay there because they haven't got anywhere else to live. And so there's, you know, that does create obviously a cycle of homelessness for them, but also about how you escape from the abuse. And that's something that we are particularly aware of, is that women remaining in accommodation where they are continued to being abused because the alternative is homelessness. There's another group that we come across a lot, which we haven't mentioned yet here, which is those with no recourse to public funds, and also particularly in London, to those who wish to stay with their community in London, but for whom NAS, the National Asylum Seekers Agency, will accommodate them only if they move out of London. So they then choose to stay in London and have something like £40 to live on. Obviously can't afford accommodation, but will stay there and then move around different accommodation. And that group is also very particularly vulnerable to abuse. So quite a number of women who come into our services are also vulnerable. The issue around no recourse to public funds is a huge one, a really big one in London, and one that we see an increasing number of are women coming in who have experienced abuse and then have got no money to live on. So, yeah.
Assembly Member Curtin, have you?
I've got one final question, which is, do most hidden homeless people eventually find somewhere to stay?
Necessarily. Not necessarily.
We see die. So.
And I think it's that earlier point that Bob, you made about stigma. You know, a lot of young people certainly don't identify as homeless, let alone hidden homeless. And we know that, you know, they're viewing it as Teresa said as well earlier, you know, they're just staying with friends. And so them necessarily accessing the right support and knowing that there's organisations out there is really important. But how we do that and kind of convince them that actually they are homeless. I know a lot of our staff regularly have to tell young people you are homeless and you are, you know, able to access these kinds of support mechanisms. And that's, you know, that piece around stigma and myth busting is a really important piece, I think, when we're talking about hidden homelessness.
One of the key findings from our research into hidden homelessness was that it wasn't a kind of early stage sort of situation. It's not, you know, you might think, well, people are kind of in a sort of hidden situation until they access the support and until they sort themselves out. And we found very clearly that wasn't the case. Those kind of situations could happen at any time in someone's homelessness career, if you like.
Okay.
Thank you. Assembly Member Cooper, you want to come in on that and then ask your question? Just remind members we've got 45 minutes left and 6 more questions.
Well, I just wanted to ask something on property supply, and then I'll go straight into my question, if that's my other question, if that's all right, Chair. You were saying about the complete shortage of available bed spaces, and I just wondered whether there really is nothing now from housing associations or local authorities in terms of the voids that they have in their properties, because that used to be quite a source, both from housing associations because they used to have a different funding mechanism and they also used to do up a lot of street properties. But local authorities, if they were going to be doing estate renewal, now that's something that's just starting to become very much on the horizon. And as you undertake a decant programme, you do end up with empty properties, sometimes pepper-potted around on an estate, and it can be quite helpful to have people move into those properties on some sort of short-term licence, and they do usually prefer to do that through an organisation rather than having lots of individual short-term tenancy arrangements with people. Is that something that has that completely died out? Is that really not available at all? Is that an area that you can see Mary's nodding away?
Yeah.
I mean, is that an area that might potentially come back as voids increase, as estate regen takes off?
we're very alive to what's available, and we do have some arrangements with some charitable housing organisations who will give us a nomination. We used to get noms from a wider range of housing associations, but they now almost entirely go through the local authority. So it's only one or two that we can get noms from, but we do get them. In terms of regen, then we have in the past, for example, Guinness Trust, we're doing a whole regen, and we got, I think, about 20 bed spaces from them for a period of time, which was very helpful. But I think the crisis is so huge at the moment in London that even when they're doing regeneration, they've got those people to move out into the other properties they've got. At the moment, if that changes, maybe obviously we'd be discussing that. But
I think I'm not really talking so much about nominations into permanent accommodation as short life,
sure,
which arose post Cathy Come Home and in
Sure.
the 70s and 80s
Yeah.
was, I mean, there was a whole forest of different organisations and boroughs had slugs, as they were rather unpleasantly called,
Guinness
short life
Trust,
user groups.
Sure. The Guinness Trust example I gave you was short life accommodation.
It was?
Yeah, so we,
Right.
yes, and also where we have noms, sometimes they are for short life. You know, they're for a 2-year period. So we do get,
But
my
so
knowledge
much-
at the moment is that
So
there
much
is
better than being on the street, though.
far less of that available, far less. There used
Right.
to be a lot more of that. I don't know about the other people, but we have very, very little of that now.
We're exactly the same thing, and this is the part of the problem. For example, Albert Kennedy Trust is another LGBT charity, and they have opened emergency accommodation through our London Youth Gateway project as well. And they had to then extend the length of stay within that emergency project because there was no one or nowhere for the people to move on to. So, and this is the thing, we need a strategic vision about homelessness so that there's the end accommodation, and then so that there isn't a bottleneck when people get into the emergency accommodation. And Mary's right, the nominations have dried up, and there's now more restrictions around pathways and local connections for boroughs to access housing within and on housing support within a borough. So if you're, for example, with our, as I mentioned earlier, with our supported accommodation funded by 4 boroughs, if you don't have a connection from those 4 boroughs, you can't get into that accommodation. So where do the other 29 boroughs, if you're an LGBT person, where do you get supported accommodation from? If you're LGBT, you have to go to the mainstream housing provider. Unfortunately, there are some who are really good, and we're working with them to improve how they work with LGBT people, but some people want specific accommodation and want that peer support from their communities, and that option just isn't there. So we need a strategic view from the Mayor, perhaps, to deliver not just for women and girls, for LGBT people, for BME people experiencing homelessness, so that there's emergency supported, and then move on accommodation, and then we can tackle the homelessness issue.
I think. No, go on. Yeah, I completely agree with that. I mean, we've got young people staying with us for far longer than they used to, and Night Stop is short-term emergency accommodation. And we have got really good examples where, particularly from a young person that I hope we've got time to hear from at some point, who've moved through from Night Stop to Stonewall, as an example of when the gateway works really well. But equally, we know, the waiting lists to get into that long-term permanent accommodation is taking longer and longer, and so young people are reliant on Night Stop for longer and other similar provisions, which means we then having an issue with supply and demand of other new young people coming to us. So there's definitely more pressure on services like Night Stop.
Essentially, I mean, what we were hearing from Teresa, you're effectively agreeing with that we're not necessarily talking about people being homeless or hidden homeless just for a few nights. We're talking about weeks, months, and I think Mary was saying actually years.
And I think actually we're now getting to the crux of it, and the crux of the explanation for hidden homelessness. And I think to some extent we've slightly conflated two different questions about the cause of hidden homelessness. We've been talking a little bit actually about the cause of homelessness amongst certain groups, and there are groups that are more vulnerable to homelessness than others. Women women fleeing violence, LGBT groups and so on, they're more vulnerable to homelessness, but why are they then hidden? And actually, that's the question that I think we need to be asking. Why are these homeless people hidden, not why are they homeless? We do kind of know why people become homeless. And that's quite well documented, and we know that certain groups are more vulnerable and more at risk of homelessness. Why is it that when they become homeless, they then enter hidden situations? And that is because of provision, and that is because of the sort of lack of adequate support. That is because there's no move-on accommodation. That's because, unfortunately, there are not swathes of empty properties, social housing properties like there were in the 1970s that can be used in creative ways. They don't exist on a scale that can help solve that problem. And so actually I think the cause of hidden homelessness is this. It's the inadequate supply of affordable housing and the fact that when people go to local authorities, they are turned away. And we've all got, real horror stories about that happening. It's been happening for years, and it happens much, much more frequently in London than it does anywhere else. But there is a reason for that as well, which I think we need to understand. It's not because housing officers are mean or they don't want to help people. It's because they don't have places to put people, and the private landlords are not wanting to rent to people on benefits anymore, and there isn't any social housing, and that's where we start getting into
I do completely accept the issue about the lack of supply chair, but I do wonder whether there might be a bit of a role for us, because I'm not sure I completely accept that housing associations and local authorities are now running no voids at all.
Absolutely.
And I do wonder whether there has been a move away from the creative use on a short-term basis, even if it's only 1% or 2% of the 158 or 168,000 units that L&Q has, which are mostly situated in London. 1% of 158 or 168,000 units is still quite a lot of accommodation that could be used for 6 months, 9 months, a year or 2 years. And I do wonder whether there's a role for us to pick that up with the G15 and others.
I'm sorry to hurry you along, but we do need to...
We did also wonder whether some sort of time threshold could be applied to the definition of hidden homelessness. I'm not sure that you can do that. That people are hiding their homelessness by quite a variety of means. And the other issue, which I think several of you have touched on, is whether or not we could improve on the definition that we're currently using for hidden homelessness. But I think to a certain extent we've also said it blends at either end.
I'd like to see squatting in your definition, not out of it. That's my only issue with your definition, actually.
You'd like to include squatting?
Yes. That it should include, I think in what you sent out to us, you said that people who squat are excluded from your definition of hidden homelessness. And I think they should be included. I think you've excluded them on the basis that there's a kind of choice element. I know we're short on time, so I won't go into it, but we know that a significant proportion of homeless people do squat.
And of course the short life movement of the 70s and 80s to a large extent came out of the squatting movement.
Exactly.
Thank you very much, Chair. That's the end of my questions.
Thank you very much. Assembly Member Gavron, just from that. Yes, thank you. 5 minutes left.
First starting with Kezia. What are the disadvantages and advantages of having the label? I mean, you've begun to sort of touch on this. This is a very broad range of housing problems, but this particular one is labelled as hidden homelessness. Is that an advantage or a disadvantage?
I'm not sure it's either, really. I mean, I think it's useful to have a definition that people can work with.
The label,
I think
yes.
For the label, well, I think people who don't define themselves as homeless just won't kind of accept the label, as they don't now with homelessness. So I don't think there's a particular advantage or disadvantage, I have to say, to having the label. People that work with homeless people might disagree with that. I don't know why that's different from the label of homelessness, why hidden homelessness should be, as a label, should be an advantage or a disadvantage.
But labelling of hidden homelessness, and you've talked about there's such a broad range
there is,
of people who come under this label. We've heard it today. of hidden homelessness. And do you think that in a way might actually do an injustice to the people who are most vulnerable? I don't know. I'm just trying to work out how.
Yeah, I think the problem with the label, it's got to be useful. I think that's the thing. It's got to be useful to, if you're going to use it, it has to be used for a purpose. The problem with the label is who you leave out, who might get left out from that. So if you start using a term like that applies to a very particular group of people, then sometimes people that actually maybe should come within it fall without it. And then if that's used as a way for people to access services or to kind of think, oh, I belong to that population and so I can now get help from A, B and C, and you're not in that group, I think that can be the problem with labels. Beyond that, I don't know if other...
Yeah, I'd be interested to know what... But it's given, it's given to the problem, hidden homelessness, but it's... I'm not sure it's helping us to really deal with it. I'm just posing that.
Is that because we still don't really quite know exactly what we mean by it? And I think that's what I mean when I say it's got to be useful. Just sort of coming up with a term. You've got to know kind of why is it that you're using this term and what does that mean and does that give people access to something? At the end of the day, it is about whether that's going to help people access support that then helps them escape that situation. I think it's useful. I do think it's useful, actually, to try and define it and to try and think about what we mean by it and who it applies to. Because then I think we do get further along to kind of saying, OK, so now what do we do about this and who are these groups? And it is very difficult. It's because it is such a wide group of people, and I don't think you want to narrow it down. I think we need to say, who does this apply to? And they might be difficult to find, and they might be difficult to sort of learn about and get information on, but, this is who we need to find out about. And I think that could be helpful.
Anybody else want to come in on this?
I think that it doesn't, I'm fairly neutral about it, but I think one of the issues for us is that it doesn't describe a lot of situations that women find themselves in. So for somebody, for example, who's living with somebody who's sexually exploiting them, then they mightn't consider themselves to be homeless. And I'm not convinced that the title or the list that you've got would apply in that situation either. I'm also not sure that a lot of women that we work with would call themselves hidden homeless. No. Some of them might define themselves as homeless, but they mightn't. I think that they're a bit of a mouthful, hidden homeless. I suspect that it's more of a policy term than a term that would apply to an individual who is homeless.
Yeah.
And I think my concern is actually even defining someone as homeless is it's a label given to someone, and I think quite often then we don't see the people, we just see the homeless, and that's by even just defining hidden. I think it then just adds another barrier to the person. And what we're trying to do is get people to the right spaces where they feel safe and they can reach their full potential. And by putting more barriers in front of people, now you have to define as hidden as well as define as homeless. It just became, I would rather have a very broad term about what is homelessness. And the shelter definition on their website it seems quite clear. If you don't have the right to stay where you live, so anybody, wherever you're living, if you don't have it written down that you've got a tenancy right or you own that property, you can stay there, or someone can come in and evict you that day. So you've got no rights there. And that's what's heartbreaking about people who are living on people's sofas, in sheds and rough sleeping. They've no right to live anywhere. As Therese have said right from the start, you need your own space. If you want to achieve at a job or at study, you need your own space. And I agree with Dr. Rees, we need a definition. The local authorities need a definition, strategic planners need a definition, but let's make it as wide as possible and include as many people as possible, and then have a strategic plan to meet the needs of homelessness in London, rather than creating a new policy around hidden homelessness and then a policy about rough sleeping. Just get a policy around working with people who have no right to live where they want to live.
So we have to be careful about not using language that young people or any people experiencing hidden homelessness wouldn't use themselves. And I think it would be interesting to know how people actually describe it and whether they refer to themselves as hidden homeless. And certainly we found that with sofa surfing, that is a term that professionals are putting on people, not a term that they're using themselves. And I think it's the same thing with hidden homeless. We've got to use the language that people are using when they're experiencing it.
Sorry, Chair, I mean, Teresa said exactly that.
Yeah.
That friends of hers said, well, why are you going there?
Yeah.
You're not hidden homeless. I think that proves your point very eloquently.
You finished Assembly Member?
Well, I think this is something we could go on.
Well,
but I don't want to
I hate to be the bad guy to try and keep you all to time. Can I just welcome into the public gallery the Sandhurst Junior School from Lewisham? You're very welcome. This is the Housing Committee, and we're currently talking about people who are unfortunate enough not to have a permanent home, and so that's what we're trying to address at the moment. If we can now, if I can ask, I beg your pardon, Assembly Member Berry.
I know I had my hand up earlier, but actually Kezia very eloquently made the points that I was going to try and drive.
Great. Assembly Member Devonish.
Nicola, and then the rest of the panel, please. How typical are your previous contributors' experiences of borough support and advice, and how can we improve it?
What, in terms of how young people have been accessing advice from local authorities?
Yes.
So it's really varied, and I think certainly for us we would very much welcome local authorities to be more aware of Night Stop, and to, there are certainly some boroughs that are very aware of the service we offer and very much refer a number of young people towards us, and then others that have never heard of it and aren't aware of the support that it can offer young people. I think for us, a lot of the young people that come to Night Stop have gone to a local authority first for advice and information, and been signposted perhaps to more traditional hostels and shelters, and very much would like to see that information and advice to look at what is safe for a young person to go to, thinking about not just a roof over their head, but the kind of support that they'll receive whilst there and the capacity to move on from homelessness. And alongside that, the level of risk they'll be surrounded by. So really recognising the fact that Night Stop, can provide that safe place to stay without that kind of chaotic behaviours surrounding them. So it's been a real mixed bag really about the relationships we have with each local authority, and I think making sure that they're all aware of the service, and about really analysing what a young person means when they're saying their experiences. We know that a lot of young people will say, I'm staying with friends and family, so I don't need it, or that's where I was staying last night, but actually was it a safe and positive influence on their life, or actually was it someone who's going to take it down a completely different negative route, and really digging beneath that. And we're really keen to explore how we can do that assessment piece more.
Thank you. Kezia?
Yeah, I think maybe in our research we tend to come across the people who've had the more negative experiences of approaching a local authority because they're still homeless, and for many people that advice and support that they're given is not meaningful to them. We did a survey once and asked whether people had gone to the local authority, whether they'd received advice and assistance and so on, and the survey results came back that a really high proportion said they'd been awarded, they'd been found to be homeless and had not been given any advice and assistance. And our first thought was, okay, surely all of these local authorities are not failing in their duty. But when we then talked to people in the qualitative interviews, they'd describe exactly what happened, and then we'd realise that they were given advice and assistance, but it was so useless to them that they had not even recognised that that's what it was. So pieces of paper with lists of private landlords that won't rent to them, hostels that are full, pretty much to them feeling like they're being turned away. Now, that's not going to be everybody's experience, and I'm sure lots of people are helped and they are given the support that they need, but there is a real problem there. But again, it goes back to the point I made earlier. I think, what else can can be done in that situation for some local authorities. You know, how are they going to actually help someone access accommodation at that point? And that's why I think they resort to, you know, being able to kind of fulfil their statutory obligations with a piece of paper without that really meaning very much. So it is a problem.
Mixed bag as well. We ask our service users every year a series of questions about their experience of statutory agencies, and the report that we got in 2016 was from 45% of them that they had a satisfactory experience of housing agencies, 55% said they had an unsatisfactory experience. I think that there's clearly gatekeeping going on, there's clearly huge pressure on housing officers, but there are some local authorities that are really trying to address that. So we've got 2 local authorities at the moment where we're training every single housing officer to deal with violence against women and girls, and we have also 3 local authorities now where we have somebody who's sitting within the housing office who's co-located there in order to help them. That can backfire, because sometimes the housing officers will then say you've got to go in and see that person on Tuesday and you've got to wait till then, and we've had that happen. But then we do have a relationship then with the housing authority in order to address that. However, I completely agree. The major issue is complete lack of housing stock, lack of alternatives, and particularly where there is vulnerability, then it's really difficult to get private sector landlords to accept somebody.
And I think it's also about accessing a whole spectrum of services when someone approaches a local authority, for example, children's services and young people's services, and there seems to be a lack of coordination. So, for example, if you're under 21 or you're under 18, you're pushed maybe to the children's services, and then they say, oh no, it's the housing department's got the duty to work with you, and then there's the person is pushed from different department, and what we're thinking, maybe touching a bit as well on the maybe the housing associations and the lack of use of empty properties and things, but that this is where we need this strategic approach to think across housing, health and care. How can we think about the use of different empty properties and accessing funding through perhaps health and care? Because housing and local authorities have, very stretched at the moment. Do we recognise that as a voluntary sector? We're their partners. We're not in competition with them. We want to work with local authorities. But they're finding it very hard to, what properties can they use? So it's maybe thinking about, well, if there's money in health and money in care, how can we support each other and think about the housing, health and care needs of the homeless?
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Apart from the boroughs themselves, you've alluded to some support organisations. What other sources of support and advice are available to people who we currently classified as hidden homeless?
Well, in terms of young people specifically, we work now with Alone in London, who provide information, advice and guidance to young people and part of the London Youth Gateway. And that's a really integral part of the Gateway to make sure young people are getting that right information. We have so many young people that come to us who are passed around multiple organisations, phoning around, turning up at places that just aren't the right place for them, and either there's no rooms available for them, or it's completely the wrong age group or gender or background needs or whatever. And at a point of crisis for a young person or any person, that's just not acceptable. So organisations like Advice in London can really control that and make sure that young people are only going to be progressing to the place that's most likely to house them for that evening. And they're a really important service for the Gateway, certainly.
The London Councils has funded Pan London Violence Against Women and Girls Services, and that's a priority for London Councils. And that this from April will include additional support around housing. So they've recognised that homelessness and violence against women and girls are connected, and that and therefore there should be a better join-up between the two going forward. It's something that we've been working on with other homelessness agencies. So for violence against women and girls, there is a whole network of support across London, where you can get advice. The problem is, of course, access to properties. There are beginning to be a few alternatives opening up, but they nowhere meet the need. So although advice and support is there, and we know that if somebody approaches a local authority and there are priority need, then they are far more likely, if they've got an advocate, to be accepted by the local authority, and so that they will get some kind of support around housing, and the right support if they have an advocate with them. So I think that picture, in terms of those people who are visible, is a slightly better one. But in terms of invisibility, we're still not meeting the needs, and also in terms of the availability of properties, that's a huge problem.
Mr. Green, yeah.
There are great examples of partnership working, but I think you need to see it in the culture of the last few years and the cuts. We've lost, within the LGBT sector, we've lost 2 charities, Pace and Broken Rainbow, over the last couple of years. We've lost Ease Housing, we've lost many other charities, and the number of youth groups, I dread to think, I don't know if there are any left. It's ridiculous, and if we're going to be thinking about prevention, and these are the great examples. We've got London Youth Gateway, we've got the London Council's funded Violence Against Women and Girls and Homelessness programme, but if we're serious about prevention, we need to be thinking about, teaching young children in schools about housing, homelessness, what to do if you're homeless. We need to be teaching young children about sexual orientation, gender identity, so that they can feel that confidence and the surety that even if they do come out and they get a bad reaction from their family members, that there are alternatives available. And it's where are those alternatives? And at the moment, as we say, the number of charities is going down. We were touch and go for a while last year, but fortunately, L&Q, one of the larger housing associations, invested in us for 3 years. So it's working about how we can work together as not just small organisations, but larger organisations. And somebody needs that strategic view of what the voluntary sector is in London to make sure that no more close. And perhaps that's the mayor.
Thank you. Assembly Member Copley.
Thank you. My first question is to Kezia, and it's what do you think will be the impact on hidden homelessness of the Homelessness Reduction Bill, assuming that it's passed?
Okay, I'm hopeful about this. I think this is a positive piece of legislation, obviously. I do have some potentially it could have an impact on hidden homelessness, in the sense that people who might otherwise not go to a local authority may start going to a local authority because they, at the moment, a lot of people think, I'm not going to bother going because if I'm not priority need, I'm not going to get anything, so I'm not going to get any help. Now maybe people think, no, the local authority is the place to go. They can offer a wider range of people a wider range of help and support. And so those people, and in our research, there were 2 quite distinct groups really. There was that group who actually, with a bit of help and support, could have escaped homelessness quite quickly. But because they didn't get it, they went into hidden homelessness, and then other things go, their experience of hidden homelessness then creates other problems and so on, and before long they're in the sort of more entrenched homeless population with more complex needs, and those people should really be helped through this legislation. There's then the group whose homelessness is more complicated to resolve. But those people certainly, and they might be more likely to go to the local authority, so that's really promising. My concerns are, firstly, that it does then offer meaningful help and support, and this comes back to the discussion that we had before about, at the moment, local authorities do have an obligation to provide advice and support, and for a lot of people, that is not resulting in a resolution of their housing problems. So this has to be something more than that. It has to be backed up by resource, by commitment, and so on. If it is, then I think it could go a long way. But again, my other concern is about, how far local authorities are actually going to be able to prevent or resolve people's housing situations when under this legislation. And what we need for that to happen is an increase in the supply of affordable, accessible accommodation. And what I see in my work is a contraction of that, mainly through welfare policy, not through housing policy. And my real concern at the moment is that welfare policy is undermining the direction that housing policy is going, particularly homelessness policy, which is about trying to make things better and try and prevent homelessness and trying to resolve homelessness. But where, you know, we know, particularly in London and places like London, that private landlords, since the changes to LHA, are more reluctant to rent to people on benefits. We know that they are more reluctant to rent to younger people since the extension of the shared accommodation rate. And in a year or two, the LHA caps are coming into social housing. We know then that, you know, younger people particularly are going to be less likely to afford social housing as well. So those kind of, never mind the cuts to housing benefit for the under 22. So all of that policy is making housing less accessible and less affordable for people on low incomes. And so I can see a kind of conflict there between the homelessness reduction policy and welfare policy, because the homelessness reduction can only work if local authorities genuinely are able to support people into accommodation. So there will need to be a whole range of schemes and initiatives to support.
So it needs to be properly funded.
Absolutely properly funded, and you know, a lot of thought given to things like private sector access schemes, those kind of, you know, relationships and partnerships.
Would if the government were to have housing LHA paid directly to landlords? Do you think that would be?
Yeah, that would make a difference.
That would make a difference.
Yeah, it does make. It would make a difference, and we know this. We've done surveys of private landlords, and the direct payment issue is a really big one. And for homeless people in particular, we did some work recently. The people, the landlords that said they would rent to homeless people said they would only do so if they could get the payment direct to them. So we know that helps in terms of private landlords.
I think Tony wants to come in on this point. So.
Just very briefly, you're probably not as aware as we are that one of the things we discuss a lot in this forum is what's called PRS, private rented sector, which is large institutional investors are building bluntly larger groups of housing in London. It's just starting. There's bound to be voids in these, and I wondered, Andrew, if we should be writing to people like Legal and General and saying, what is going to be your social responsibility angle? What about this?
Yeah, absolutely.
Quite useful. Yes, indeed.
Would anyone else like to comment on the issue of the homelessness reduction bill before I move on? Okay. And indeed welfare, if there's anyone who wants to. Okay, we'll, because of time, I'll move on to my next question, which is Nicola, first of all. And it's on the housing benefit for under 21s. What do you think the effect will be of the removal of housing benefits, for under 22s? Sorry.
Obviously, we're really disappointed about those plans and the impact they will have for under 22-year-olds. We think that this assumption that young people should really be staying with their families just doesn't resonate with the evidence we have with the young people accessing services at DePaul. Family breakdown is by far the biggest reason that people come to us, and so this assumption that more young people can stay at home and it's just not safe or possible to do so is really unlikely. And then in addition to that, there's the kind of the challenge with landlords as well, and about how they're going to have to agree to let properties without knowing whether young people can actually access that housing benefit. So we are expecting there to be an increase of demand on services like Night Stop, and we haven't got enough volunteers probably to meet that demand.
I mean, I think the government's saying there will be certain groups that are protected. I mean, do you think that goes far enough? I mean, will that protect people who, for example, are the victims of family breakdown?
The worry is no, it won't. And I think there needs to be things much more explicit in both the homelessness reduction bill and in the changes around housing benefit to young people who are hidden homeless, and making sure they are prioritised by any kind of crisis service.
I read that, I mean, this will save something like £3 million, which in the great scheme of things is not really a huge amount of money. and it will only take 140 young people to become homeless in order for that to be wiped out by having to spend money elsewhere. Would you say this is a false economy?
Yeah, absolutely.
Bob, I'm interested from your perspective, the impact on young LGBT people who are disproportionately make up the homelessness figures.
Yeah, if just comment on the housing benefit for under 21s. There will be exemptions, but again, you have to jump through hoops to get those exemptions, and yet if you have to be able to evidence serious or significant harm, if you were to remain in your parental home or the home that you're living in at the moment where you're experiencing domestic abuse, for example, we don't know how they're going to measure that significant harm, and it's already hard enough for young people to go through the administration process to get welfare benefits. Now they're going to have to go through even more of a process and not get any money while that process is going on. So where do they live while that process is happening? And how do we support someone to make that application for the housing benefit? And how long is it going to take? Will the private landlords who are willing to accept young people on benefits still wait that period of time? So how long is that going to be? We're going to have young people on the streets for 6 to 12 months while they sort out their benefits. I can't believe it went through on a Friday and it's coming, you know, with very little noise, and now it's going to be introduced the week after next. I can't swear on this on the webcast, but if I could, I would. I think it's going to hit LGBT young people, it's going to hit young women, it's going to hit all young people under the age of 21, and whatever little short supply there is in housing, I don't know how they're going to afford to live in it. And as I can't put it more eloquently than Dr. Reeve did, this policy is undermining all of the ambitions that this committee and other people have to address people's housing needs.
Yeah. Anyone else like to comment on this issue?
I think the test is one of the crucial. I mean, the issue itself is crucial in terms of what everybody else has said, but I think that we are particularly concerned about what the test for significant harm would be and how that would be implemented. We know that the implementation of duty already is really problematic for our service users, and so we can only see that this would increase. We've also got the issue of where there is available accommodation, like in refuges, we assume that we'd still be able to take this group in and we'd get housing benefit, but where do we move those on to? We've already got a problem with bed blocking in refuges, and this will significantly increase the problem.
Thank you. Okay,
thank you very much. We've finished our questions to our professional panel. It's appropriate that we start accidental, but probably appropriate that we start the session with the voices of people who are hidden homeless, and we finish it as well. And so we have with us Cory, who is a night stop user, if that's correct. Can I ask you, Cory, we haven't got a lot of time, but can I ask you, how did you find yourself in the situation that you're in, and what's your experience of being homeless, or hidden homeless, shall we say?
In a nutshell, I've been independently homeless since I was 13. I'm now 21.
13?
Yeah. And I left home myself when I was 13, based on abuse from my biological father. Now, the problem is that people always ask me, why don't you just go home? And I did about 5 times. It never worked. It got to a point where it was life-threatening. But it's not that rational. He wasn't the same to my siblings or my mum. They loved him, so I decided to leave. I then ended up getting like 18 GCSEs and going to America on scholarship. And when I came back, I tried to start living at home again. And it worked for a while. And then my life was threatened. And then I found myself on the streets. Now, the difference was that before I went to university, I was staying with family and friends. I only had to sleep rough like a couple of times. And for me, it was just life. I'd just get to McDonald's at 4 a.m. each morning, do work. That's how I got my GCSEs. I'd do like sport and extracurriculars, anything I could to be productive. Because I knew that there were other people who weren't so productive but had the same circumstances. And some of the smartest people I know are still on street corners. And they could have been more, but they just weren't. And I didn't want that for myself. After I came back from America and went back home, there wasn't the offer or opportunity to stay with family and friends. So I was just sleeping rough. And I found myself in terrible environments where I didn't know that I was being abused. Like, it was what it was. Like, these were the environments I was staying in. I slept on doorsteps, sometimes family doorsteps. I slept in Euston Station. I tried to sleep on buses. I slept, yeah, I tried to sleep in a load of places. I didn't actually know what was out there. I ended up going somewhere called New Horizons in King's Cross. I found out about it through a friend of a friend, which tells, I don't know why there isn't more publicity about things like this. And before I went to America, I didn't regard myself, I didn't say I was homeless. No one knew. My mum had to call up my sixth form tutor to tell her, like, this is the situation, include this in the application, and maybe that helped get my scholarship, I don't know. But when I went to New Horizons after sleeping rough, and I came on my first day really anxious, I was shaking, and I couldn't get away from some of the people that I met in my travels sleeping rough. I ended up going onto Night Stop, and my first day, I couldn't remember what it felt like to sleep on the bed. I literally went back to New Horizons the next day after my first night stop and told someone who worked with me that. And she almost cried, but for me, this was just life. It didn't seem like something to cry about. And then I moved into some emergency temporary accommodation with the Albert Kennedy Trust called Purple Door. And I couldn't get housing in time for them to move me onto there, but they let me stay for an elongated amount of time, so there was only so much they could do. If it weren't for Night Stop, just taking me back the first day I had to move out of Purple Door, I would have been sleeping rough again. And yet again, okay, so I knew what it felt like to sleep in a bed this time, and I finally had a room with a lock on the door, which is something I didn't think I'd have at one point. But I'd forgotten what it felt like to be in a family home. And yeah, you can't stay at places like Stock for like really elongated places of time, but like one of the people from Night Stop taught me how to ride a bike for the first time, and I'm 21. That's kind of embarrassing. And yeah, it was amazing. And I've just actually moved into accommodation with Stonewall. And I'll share something with you. I was really late, and then I walked in here, and at least one or two of you were thinking, yeah, this guy looks homeless. And maybe, I don't even know. And I didn't want to come in this morning because I wanted to come here, but I just didn't want to be anywhere outside of my bed and the lock on the door. And that's not just because I had the bed and the lock on the door. That is because last night I ran into a couple of people that I'd come across while I was sleeping rough. And I found myself in a situation and I froze. But I managed to get myself out of it. And the reason I'm sharing that with you now is because, yeah, it explains me being late. Like, I couldn't bring myself out of my room. So I hope that helps. But also, the only thing that got me out of that situation is the fact that I had a room with a lock on the door. And I don't think you realize, I haven't had time to practice anything in the mirror. So I'm really unprepared as well as late. But I don't think you realize when you're in this situation, you don't feel like you deserve anything. I was in employment once, recently, whilst I was on Night Stop, and my employer found out that I was homeless. Now, the day before, he said, you're amazing. This was like a pub job. It's like the customers love you. The next day, somehow, it wasn't cutting it after he knew I was homeless. And somehow, I was just instantly not allowed to come back. Luckily, I got a job. I got a call saying that I'd got a job that I really wanted to get, like 2 days later, and it's paid like £70 an hour, and it's with someone called Elevate Education, and it's amazing. And they want me to put some of my story in the official introduction of their script, because they go into schools and give motivational speeches and seminars and like study skills and success skills and stuff. And I've also done something for New Horizons where they've asked me to share my story. But I don't understand why that sort of story is invisible to you, why I need to share it so often, because so many people I know go through exactly the same thing.
Can I just ask you, you said that you tried, you didn't consider yourself homeless in many ways. And did you try any agencies? Did you try, I mean, apart from you came across New Horizons, had you tried going to the borough, to any other agencies beforehand?
Yeah, I mean, it's not that I didn't...
And what was the reaction you got from them? You know?
It's not that I didn't consider I knew I was homeless. Like, even before I went to university, when I said I was staying with family and friends and I only had to sleep rough a couple of times, there was nowhere stable. Like, I didn't have an official home. The outside world became home, and home became danger. So I knew I was homeless, but I didn't share it with anyone, because as soon as you tell someone you're homeless, suddenly you're a terrible person. Suddenly you're not worth anything. And they tell you to do the things that I'd done, and I still made sure I'd done well in education. I got a scholarship abroad whilst not having a home, and somehow that didn't help my situation. And there still wasn't housing for me. And when I was 17, I called the council. I was a young associate with a theatre company called ICT. And yeah, I called the council with them because it took a lot. I always made myself better. I always had to deal with it myself. So to ask for help, that didn't happen. But they got me to call the council. And when I called, I explained the entire situation. And I don't know if the guy that I spoke to just was feeling lazy that day, but all he said to me was, "You're not vulnerable because you're a boy." And my question to you is, if I'm not vulnerable because I'm a boy, why do so many predators take their chances? Like, it does. I didn't ask for help after that. Even when I came back from America and I started sleeping rough for an elongated period of time, it was months before I found New Horizons. And that was the first time after that I could bring myself to ask for help of any kind. And that's the first time after that I could allow myself to vocally say I'm homeless, because that's the first time I realized that if you went to the right people and disclosed that you might actually get help. And so, yeah.
I'm going to ask Assembly Member Cooper to ask a question, if you can.
I think you were here when I was talking about short life housing earlier on. So some of it people would move into and it might not be in great condition. And one of the things that made the rent very cheap was that they might have to do it up a bit, paint it, maybe even put the lock on the bedroom door that you were talking about. How would you have felt if someone had said, we've got a place, it's yours for 6 months or maybe a year, but you've got to do a bit of work to make it okay to live in? Would you have taken something on like that?
Well, yeah. I mean, in itself, like, being homeless is work. Like, if you're telling me I'm going to have my own room with a lock on the door, but I have to paint it, that's not work to me. That's what I need.
That's preparation of somewhere that's then going to be your spot.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, I hate to be the bad guy again and draw it to a close. Is there anything you want to say before I do close the meeting for this session?
I don't know. Thank you for...
Well, you've been extremely eloquent. I mean, I covered all the bases that we probably were going to question you on anyway. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
And I wish you well in the future.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you so much.
Members, and we're now going to move on to the formal bit. I'm really grateful that you could attend. Where are we now? Before we finish off, I'll just take this opportunity to remind anybody that's who's watching, who's experienced hidden homeless, to take a couple of minutes to complete our survey and to share the link with others. The URL has been tweeted via the Assembly feed with the hashtag of Between Homes. Can I ask members to note the report and the discussion that we've had this morning?
Agreed.
Now, we've got 3 other items of business. The Housing Committee work programme. Can members note the initial priorities for its work programme for the 2017-18 Assembly year as set out in paragraphs 4.1 and 4.7 of the report?
Agreed.
The date of the next meeting, subject to confirmation at the annual meeting of the Assembly on the 3rd of May, is set for 18th of May 2017 at 2:30 p.m. in this chamber. Noted?
Noted.
And there is no urgent business to discuss. I therefore declare the meeting closed. Thank you very much.
GLA Chamber Sound. GLA Chamber Sound.